Kim Stanton was one of 3 commissioners on the Mass Casualty Commission. Thanks for joining me, Commissioner Stanton.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Andrew.
Your report offers a very detailed timeline on those terrible 13 hours in April of 2020, and it flags numerous police failings and even a lack of some basic policing techniques, things like knowing the terrain, alerting the public, communicating among first responders. How much work does the RCMP face in order to be prepared with situations like this?
It does face some work, but it can be done. We set out a pathway for how the RCMP and any police agency can ensure that the pre-critical incident response planning and preparation is done and done well. We dedicate a whole section of our report to everyday policing and the ways in which basic policing tasks can be done better, and to set people up for the ability to have a critical incident response that is effective, that keeps police officers safe, and that helps keep community safe.
You are calling for some big changes for the RCMP and saying that Canadian society faces a reckoning on policing. So based on what you've seen and heard over this inquiry and since, how confident are you about these changes actually being put in place?
I think we're at a moment in Canadian society where people are really wanting to look at how we can be safer, how we can keep one another safer. We're also at a moment where we're really looking at how do we want police to do better and be a more cohesive part of our community safety and well-being. And I think people are ready for there to be change in how we go about that. And we talk about really looking at prevention first. So rather than getting to the point where we're enforcing the criminal law or responding to a critical incident, how do we prevent violence in the first place? And there are lots of ways in which we in our communities can start to do that one-on-one. And we think that the police also, we heard from members of the police who really want to do better as well. And we want to equip them to do better. So I think it's time.
Your report does acknowledge that there have been many previous calls for RCMP reform. So I'm curious, going through your recommendations, how many of your calls for action overlap with what we've seen at previous inquiries but just haven't been implemented yet?
One of the things that we did from the outset was in our mandate, we were asked to look at prior inquiries and reports that were relevant to our mandate. And we did an environmental scan of 2,000 recommendations from prior inquiries. And the way that we proceeded was to say, are these recommendations that have been made before, and if they have, why weren't they implemented, or are they new to this inquiry? And we have dedicated a volume of the report to implementation and identified some of the past barriers and suggested a way forward. And we suggested a mutual accountability body that would include members of the affected communities, of those most affected from the April 2020 mass casualty, from the police, from the federal and municipal and provincial governments, to hold one another to account and to report publicly on the progress of implementation.
All right, one item that you want to see progress on is a national review of public alert systems. So tell me what you want to see happen and how fast do you think changes can come?
Right. So it's apparent to us that there are improvements that can be made in terms of the public alerting system. And there is a review that's coming up in any event to public alerting with respect to the current partners that are there. And we say, take a look at the governance. Canada's unique in the world in that we have a private corporation that is essentially the governance party for our public alerting. And we believe that the federal government Ministry of Public Safety should really be in that role, and that there should be engagement with provincial and municipal partners and territorial and Indigenous partners in the alerting system. And we think it's actually very important that it happen soon.
Another element of your report looks at the urban-rural divide on some of these issues when it comes to policing, access to services, and you say rural Canadians, not just in Nova Scotia, but elsewhere across the country, aren't being as well served as they could be. Why is that, and how does that play into your report as you went back and looked at the events of 2020?
So one of the things that we focused on throughout the inquiry was the rural context in which this mass casualty occurred. And it's really important to take into account that context, because it's just the case that it's further between detachments, it's further in terms of response times for people living in rural and remote parts of the country, and that's a lot of Canada. And what we found in our review of policing and a number of the other aspects of our mandate is that policy is, generally speaking, designed for urban centers and not really taking into account the rural context. And we had a significant amount of information provided to us that really lays out how important it is for provinces and territories to take into consideration the needs, the resourcing needs in rural areas. There is a number of factors that cause there to be a different context for people living in rural areas, and it needs to be addressed.
All right, Commissioner Kim Stanton, there's a lot in this report to go over. Certainly we'll be looking at it in the coming days and weeks, not just today. So thank you for taking the time with me today.
We're so grateful that you took the time. Thanks so much. Take care.